All right, good evening, everybody. Welcome to tonight's class. This week's parsha, Lech Lecha, an amazing parsha where we read about Avraham Avinu, our forefather, the first Jew. What's fascinating is that Avram and Sarah, together they stand up and they take a stand against an entire world against them, a world steeped in pagan idolatry, and they will stand up and declare monotheism, declare one God, and live a life like that, but not just live a personal life like that, but be the trailblazers, traveling around, spreading the message of the one God in this world. Now, what's fascinating about Judaism in general that we find is anytime we have a conversation about Jewish identity, Jewish observance, and Jewish culture, we know how in Judaism, the idea of community is so important, which in a big way has been one of the reasons why COVID has been so tough. Because one of the things that COVID really took away from us is that ability to flow seamlessly as a community. But Baruch Hashem, in many communities, we've come up with different ways, especially here in Chabad and Mequon, different ways of how to try to keep the community together, keep that community feeling in whatever way possible. Now, what's interesting is that when you talk about a proud Jew, it's a Jew who stands with their people. When you talk about an involved Jew, it's a Jew who shows up to communal functions. When you talk about a passionate Jew, it's a Jew who sees themselves as a link in the heritage of our people. What ends up happening is, it sounds like, to be a Jew means to fit into a particular mold, some kind of generic fitting in to something much larger. And if that's the case, is that really what Judaism is all about? Isn't Judaism about creating a relationship with God? And if it means just mimicking everybody else's relationship, that sounds like a very dry, uninspiring relationship, very generic relationship, and to truth be told, sounds like a very needless relationship. Because why just do what everybody else is doing and having to fit into what everybody else is doing? You see, Judaism is pretty simple. There's a set of rules of what we're supposed to do from the moment we wake up to the moment we go to sleep, and everybody seems to be doing exactly, or supposed to be doing exactly the same thing. And if that's the case, where is there room for individuality in Judaism? Or maybe there isn't. What about uniqueness? Yeah. We're going to explore this topic a little bit tonight. And we are going to start with the hero of this week's Torah portion, Avraham Avinu. At 99 years old, God comes to him and God gives him the commandment of circumcision. And he circumcises himself. Love the text. So God tells Avraham Avinu, you should keep my covenant. I'll make a covenant with you. Not just with you, but with the generations to come. Every single Jewish male should be circumcised. And this will be a sign and a covenant, or a sign of a covenant, between me and you forever and ever. That's the deal that they make. Now, it doesn't stop there. We go forward. And by Har Sinai, once again, we are given the command. And on the 8th day, you shall circumcise the child. And ever since then, one of the most celebrated Jewish events is the circumcision of a child at 8 days old. Now, what's interesting is, Maimonides points out how when it comes to doing the mitzvahs, it's extremely important to understand that every single mitzvah that we do is done because God has commanded us at Sinai, where we all witnessed 600,000 men between the ages of 20 and 60. That must mean that there were at least somewhere between 2 to 4 million people. You count all the other men above 60 and under 20, and all the women standing there. Must have been somewhere between 2 to 4 million people standing there witnessing what took place at Sinai. And that is why we do any mitzvahs today. So, for example, when it comes to the mitzvah of not eating the sciatic nerve in the back of an animal, the reason why we do it is not because of the story that took place with Jacob and the angel, but rather because that's what we were commanded at Sinai. And the same thing is when it comes to the bris milah, the circumcision. We don't do it because our forefather Abraham was commanded by God at 99 years old and took it upon himself. Rather, because that's what we were commanded at Sinai. However, this seems a little bit intriguing because when it comes to the idea that the reason why we do our mitzvahs is because we were commanded at Sinai. If we take a look at the blessing made by the circumcision, it seems to tell a different story. The Gemara in Tractate Shabbos tells us as follows: Avia ben Am, the father of the child being circumcised, says that you commanded us, you've commanded us to enter the child into the covenant of Abraham our father. What does that tell you? Seemingly the beginning is telling us that God commanded, which would fit with once upon a time the command that took place at Sinai. But then we say to the covenant of Avram. Why are we calling it the covenant of Avram if the reason why, like Maimonides clearly pointed out, that we do mitzvahs because of the covenant at Sinai? So why are we even bringing Avram into the picture? Yes, he was the first Jew to be commanded to be circumcised. But like we said, that's not why we do it. To mention him would be great. But to call it the covenant of Avram, how can we call it his covenant? Yeah. The idea is like this. The fact that Sinai was a covenant for all of us was a changing moment in the history of the Jewish people. Until the Jewish people stood at the foot of Mount Sinai to receive the Torah and enter a covenant with God. We were just a family, a band of brothers, starting from Avram, Sarah, and Yitzchak, to the development and birth of the 12 tribes, with their sisters, their children. They moved to Egypt, and it's a large family that gets enslaved. This large family goes into an even larger family until they're overpopulating in Egypt. But they're just a family with different customs and traditions than the people around them. They were definitely recognizable how unique they were. They ate differently than other people. They spoke differently. They conducted themselves differently. They dressed differently. But they were just a family. When they stood at Har Sinai, they became a nation. This is what it says. When the Jewish people stood at Sinai and said, we will na'aseh v'nishma, we will do and we will hear, they came into a covenant with God. A covenant that created us and turned us into the nation that we are. The nation that we are till this very day. Now, the problem is, between you and me, we weren't there. This happened over 3,300 years ago. And if that's the case, how could this have been a covenant for all of us if we were not there? How can this be something that is binding, that makes me part of a nation, obligated to learn Torah and keep its mitzvahs, if I was not standing there, if you were not standing there? You see, in truth, Moshe Rabbeinu himself addresses this issue. And he says it's not just with you who are standing here today in the desert that this covenant and oath is being made. Rather, those who are here today and those who are not here today. Those who will come about later on in the future. But it's actually more than that. You see, the covenant was not just with the people standing there. It was with the souls of all generations to come. As stated in the Medrash, a work from the times of the Mishnah. And it says that even those who were in purgatory became alive and rose to their feet in order to stand there with the covenant. And from here we learn out that all souls that would eventually come down into bodies, throughout all the future generations, every single soul was at Sinai. You and I were both standing there. You may not remember. There are those who claim to have remembered what took place, even though they were only born into a body hundreds or thousands of years later. And we know such a concept is definitely possible. But most of us don't necessarily remember that experience. But the soul was definitely there, and the soul definitely remembers. We see this concept in Jewish law. Just for those that learn 3 chapters of Rambam a day, we learned this last week regarding the laws of an oath. We know that in Judaism, spoken word, taking responsibility just by saying I will do such and such, or I won't do such and such, is extremely, extremely important that we keep our word and realize that our word is golden and valuable. Another person should be able to trust us for our word. We should be able to trust ourselves based just on what we say. And that anything we say will be binding, to the point that if we transgress, that is a biblical prohibition. Now, that is, as long as the oath doesn't go against another oath. So for example, if a person wakes up this one day and says, I swear I will not eat today, and later on decides, I swear I will eat today, the second oath is completely invalid because it goes against the earlier oath that they made that morning. But the same thing would be if a person swears that a person swears that I will eat something not kosher today. Such an oath or a vow is completely invalid. Why? Because a person already took that oath at Sinai that they won't eat that non-kosher food. So to make an oath against that, to make an oath on top of that or against that, is completely useless and has no value to it. As the Talmud tells us, somebody who swears, I will not give money. The Talmud queries, is he talking about a poor person? And if he's talking about a poor person who needs the money, a person cannot make that oath that I will not give them money, because a person already made an oath at Sinai that I will give charity, I will help those in need. And if that's the case, the oath of I will not give, I swear I will not give, is completely useless. Mara says it must be we're talking about a case where it was to a rich person, and then you have a choice to give or not to give. Then the oath is binding. But we see over here how the halacha, the Jewish law, sees that the oath which was taken at Sinai is something which applies to all Jews who will be born throughout all the generations, even those who were not physically standing at Sinai. But spiritually, we were all there, and that covenant is definitely binding. You see, what took place at Sinai was that covenant and that oath that every single Jewish soul took upon itself to be a part of this community, to be a part of this process and responsibility of a Jew. Yeah. Something that was fascinating, that takes place after Sinai, is that all the mitzvahs that we will end up doing in the future, after our Sinai, after the Torah was given, after we all entered into that covenant, is how every single mitzvah is done with a physical object, and it makes that object holy. So for example, a person is going to use tefillin. It takes leather, and it makes that leather holy. A person is going to pick up a book, a Torah book, which is just paper with ink on it. A person uses that to learn or print Torah on it, makes that holy. A woman lights Shabbos candles. The time that those are lit for Shabbos, those are holy candles. There's a holiness being imbued into that physical object. But ultimately, All the mitzvahs that we do change the object, but not necessarily the person. So for example, when a person gives tzedakah, that money might become holy, but the person's hand doesn't change. The man who puts on the tefillin have that holiness, but as soon as the tefillin are off, the holiness stays with the tefillin. That's why, for example, you cannot bring tefillin into a bathroom. But the person who wore the tefillin can walk to the bathroom afterwards, no problem, once they take off the tefillin. The same thing is, a person holding a holy book cannot walk into a dirty place with that book. That's safer, but as soon as they put it down, they're free to go. However, there is one mitzvah that is an exception to this rule, and that is unique in that sense, and that is the mitzvah of bris milah, the mitzvah of circumcision. The mitzvah of circumcision changes the person's physical body. As Hashem tells Avram to circumcise, and that it should be something which is recognizable in the flesh, and that will be a covenant that lasts forever. What's the idea? The Alter Rebbe tells us that the specialness or the specialty of the bris, that is when the holy soul, the godly soul, enters into the body properly. Now, I'm just going to preface before we continue with this, that what about a woman? Right? I don't want to alienate half the crowd here, or more than half the crowd, I should say. And the idea is like this. So firstly, we're going to explore how bris is something much bigger than the particular mitzvah itself, but it has a much greater, so to say, global impact on all the other mitzvahs in the Torah. But before we even get there, that the Gemara says that a woman is born as if the bris had already taken place. In other words, what the bris represents that a man has to go through, a woman has already gone through just by being born. That is one way the Gemara takes it. The second way the Gemara takes it, and these are not necessarily two separate ways, is that a soul that, we know that every soul that comes down, both male and female, are really two halves of one soul. And one half of the soul still needs to go through a particular process, and that is the male half of the soul. The female half of the soul does not need to go through that process. And the body itself is already receptive to the Holy Soul. So if by a male, then when does this godly soul properly come into the body? We'll discuss in a moment what that means, is by the bris. By a woman, that is by the reading of the Torah. That is actually why it is the Chabad custom that when it comes to naming a baby girl that is born, many communities either wait till Shabbos, which means that if the baby is born on a Sunday, they'll wait till the upcoming Shabbos to give the naming. Or some may even wait longer to another opportunity. In Chabad, the custom is that the first opportunity, the first Torah reading, we will give the name. So if the baby's born Sunday, we'll give the name. The naming will be on Monday. And the idea is that that's when the godly soul comes into the body. So why would we wait? By the baby boy, we have no choice to wait until the circumcision, because the Torah says 8 days, not before 8 days. So you can't do it before. But by the baby girl that is born, we want to do it at the first opportunity, because there is absolutely no reason to wait. And that's because the body itself, a woman's body is already more refined than that of the male, and therefore is ready to receive the godly soul at the first moment possible. And we try to do it at the first public moment, which will be by the reading of the Torah. Now, we have two souls. Essentially, we have what is generally known as the animal soul, without getting into the animal aspect of it. There is the soul that keeps us alive, biologically, keeps our heart pumping, the blood flowing through our veins, and everything in our body working. So to say, the electricity that runs through us. Now, we have another soul. That is the godly soul. But the godly soul doesn't really connect with the body until the circumcision is done. And it's at that point that the name is given and the godly soul is drawn into the body. And so to say, where does the godly soul leave its mark? That is by the circumcision. That's where we see the pure connection between the soul and the body. And in the words of the Rebbe, as you have in front of you. Sorry, Linda, I forgot you have the book. It's on page 36.
Thank you.
That's the idea that the soul, that the godly soul is going to now start leaving its mark on the body. And that holiness, in a way that the body and soul now become one, that the godly soul is able to become part of the life of the body, not just a separate entity from the body. To understand this better, let's look at the mitzvah of bris. Not something that is just a mitzvah on its own, that it's one of the 613 mitzvahs, and that there are 612 other mitzvahs which are done with the body. But actually, we're going to understand the mitzvah of circumcision. And again, this applies to both males and females, how it becomes a much greater and global impact on the person. And that is, as follows. The unique quality of the mitzvah of bris, in other words, what it represents, is something that was given to us, bequeathed to us, by our forefather Avraham Avinu. You see, the obligation to do the circumcision, that was something, like the Rambam said before, that was something that came from Sinai, and that's it. And that's how we have to fulfill that mitzvah. However, when it comes to the idea that my physical body cannot become a vehicle of God, a vehicle to the godly soul, that is something that was given to us by Avram. And that's why we call it the covenant of Avram. You see, the mitzvah of bris, like we said before, is not just the mitzvah itself. Rather, it's the process. You see, the mitzvah of bris can be done on 3 levels, in a way of thought, speech, and action. As we had in Hayom Yom earlier this week, it says that Avraham Avinu went through this process. Where did he circumcise, which just represents the idea of removing the dullness and insensitivity? First, he started with his mind, the machshava, a person's thoughts. That was the process that he went through in order to recognize God. It was a rigorous process. It didn't happen overnight. It happened over years, somewhere between the ages of 3 to 40. Then he didn't stop there, but he turned that into speech. And that's when he went around advertising, talking to people about this, expressing these ideas. And ultimately, by Avram, he ended off with doing the actual action of circumcision only at age 99. Nowadays, we reverse the process, and we start with the action, and then let everything follow suit. So it comes out with the mitzvah of bris. There's one aspect to it that it's one of 613 mitzvahs, and that it's not necessarily too different than any other mitzvah. The mitzvah that's done. But then there's an aspect of mitzvah where it completely transforms every single mitzvah. You see, it represents an idea that mitzvahs are not something we do, but rather a way of life of who we are, and they imbue every part of our life. It's like the Rebbe once told somebody that the ultimate effect of tefillin should be that this person, even after they take off the tefillin, it's still recognizable on them that they wore tefillin that day. That when they come home from work at the end of the day, several hours after putting on tefillin in the morning, it should still be recognizable that they wore tefillin that day, not because they wrapped it too tight around their arm and the marks are still there, but rather because it transformed them. It brought the world of tefillin and godliness into their physical lives. And that's what the bris represents. That bris represents removing that insensitivity that we have to spirituality and holiness, and being able to bring that in every aspect, in every part of our lives. And that is something that we all can work on every day. And we see this idea in the process of what actually takes place takes place at the bris. So the bris starts, the mohel, one who gives the circumcision, starts off, and he makes a blessing, the one who commanded us on the commandment of the circumcision. And really what he's referring to is whatever took place at Sinai. That at Sinai, God made a covenant with us and gave us a commandment that on the 8th day, every Jewish male should be circumcised, every baby. Okay, then comes the father. And the father makes his own blessing. It says the one who commanded us to bring the child into the covenant of Avram Avinu. What's the father adding over here? What is he referring to? That's the idea of what we were bequeathed by Avram Avinu, that we can imbue our physical lives with godliness and holiness, that we can turn our bodies into vehicles for our godly soul. And then, once we recognize that, the process starts. Everybody who's standing there responds and says, just like you brought him into the covenant, he should also be entered into Torah, marriage, and good deeds. What does this mean? The idea here is that now the process starts. You see, the technical process of the circumcision is something that happens on the 8th day and it's over a few days later once the baby's healed. But it's much more than that. It's something that is now a process of a way of living, that the way this child will grow up will be to learn Torah, to get married properly according to Jewish law, and live a very healthy a healthy life with relationships, and ultimately a life of good deeds. And we know that we say the same thing, the same terminology of chuppah, Torah, chuppah, and maasim tovim, of Torah, marriage, and good deeds, as well when a baby girl is born. Because even though, so like we said before, that she is born, like the Gemara says, as if she already had gone through the physical circumcision, but the idea of the lifestyle change that it's supposed to bring about starts the moment the godly soul enters the body. And for the boys, the same thing, just it happens to be on the 8th day after the physical circumcision takes place. But by both of them, it's a start to a process. It doesn't just end after the circumcision is over. So based on all this, that the idea of the bris, in other words, the two stages, is what was commanded at Sinai, and that was the technical aspect of the mitzvah. And then there was the aspect of what we were given by the covenant of Avram, and that is the extension that we can bring that spirituality into the body. Because when it came to accepting the covenant with God at Sinai, it was on a soul level. Only the souls were there. The bodies were not there yet. So when does the body take upon that responsibility and that process? That happens at the bris. That happens, and for the girl, at birth and the naming. That's extending the covenant from a soul covenant to a body covenant. We started off the class with the idea of, is there any place for individuality in Judaism? And the idea is like this. When it comes to the aspect of sameness, on a soul level, we're all cut from the same exact cloth. As the Alter explains in Tanya, that one of the great ways of understanding how we can have true love for another Jew is don't get caught up in your differences, because our differences come from our bodies, not from our souls. In the world of the soul, there is no place for disagreement or pronounced differences, even though every soul is unique. But every soul is unique, but that doesn't create distance and differences between one another. And that's why on a soul level, we're really all one and we really all get along. It's the body that gets in the way. And when I say the body, it can mean much more than just the physical body. It means personalities, character traits, flaws, the way we think, the way we feel. To the point that the Gemara tells us that if you ever see 600,000 Jews gathered together, you make a blessing. Blessed are you, King of the universe, who knows all the secrets. This is referring to the fact that no two people think alike, just like no two people look alike. And this Gemara is actually very telling. You see, No normal person would walk around saying, oh, you look different, that's just weird. Because everybody looks different. No two faces are alike, and that's an accepted fact. But for some reason, we think that if somebody thinks differently, somebody acts differently, if somebody feels differently, then maybe over there I can question it, or I can push it, and I can say, hey, why are you thinking differently? Why do you act differently? Why are your characteristics different than mine? And that's what Gemara is telling us, that just like when it comes to no two faces are alike, no two minds are alike. Everybody is different. Everybody is unique. And we have to come around to understanding that and respecting that. And that's how we can come around to understanding and respecting our differences. But again, where does this come from? This comes from the body, not from the soul. So if you think about it like this, let's put it in different terms. What happened at Sinai was when every single soul, our commonalities, all signed up to be part of a covenant, to be part of a collective of souls. And that's a no-brainer, because our souls all get along and our souls are exactly the same. They're all cut from the same cloth, with their unique differences, but from the same cloth. So what's celebrated by the covenant of Sinai, the bris at Har Sinai, that is celebrating our commonality. However, what we got from Avram Avinu, the trailblazer, was how each of us can connect to God in an individual way, celebrating our individuality. You see, one of the ways that Hashem promises Avram Avinu that he will have children, and many children, is Hashem uses two terminologies. One is, your children will be like the sand of the earth, which it's impossible to count. There's an infinite amount, almost infinite. Another way that the Jewish people, at least the future of the Jewish people is referred to, is like the stars of the heavens, which are also, you can't count them. They're innumerable. Now, seemingly just two ways of saying something very nice, how the Jewish nation will go on and on and on. Some want to say that the difference between the two terminologies has to do with some people will be like the stars with their heads in the clouds in the heavens, and some people will be like the sand with their feet on the earth. And you have two different types of Jews. The Jew, the studious guy, and the studious Jew, and the one who's good at business, one who's good at worldly things. But this is a fascinating insight from Rav Kook. Ram Yitzchak HaKohen Kook, the first Ashkenazic chief rabbi of the pre-state Israel. He took on this role in 1917. He was originally born in Latvia, but made his move to Eretz Yisrael in 1904. He was a Kabbalist, a philosopher, a rabbi, a fascinating personality. And he writes as follows. He says, when it comes to Judaism, there are two aspects. There is the communal aspect, and there is the Jewish collective, and that valuer will sacrifice the individual for a communal goal. And that's the idea of the sand. You see, there are no names for every morsel, every kernel of sand that there is. It's an infinite amount of sand. Nobody knows how much sand there is. Nobody looks twice at one piece of sand over another piece. It's all just sand. And that's it. It says that's the idea of the collective body of the Jewish nation, or the concept of the collective. However, there's another aspect of Judaism, and that's where Judaism creates space for the individual to connect with God in a unique way. That's symbolized by the star. Every star shines differently, shines brightly, and has its own unique light. Stars have their own identities, their own names. We recognize different stars for different reasons. And that's the idea of recognizing that uniqueness that every single Jew brings to the table. Now we can understand the two covenants that took place. The covenant at Har Sinai was on a soul level, that collective. The covenant that took place, that we refer to as the covenant of Avram Avinu, the bris on the physical body, the uniqueness that each one of us carries, a whole other form. And that's the idea that like we said before, following, representing these two covenants, we say Torah marriage, and good deeds. And that's the idea how each individual has to look at the Torah, learn Torah on their own, and say, what message do I walk away with? What can I understand? When it comes to interpersonal relationships, represented by the concept of marriage, it's what kind of relationships will I have? What do I have to bring to the table when it comes to relationships? How will I choose to have these relationships? And when it comes to unique contribution that we all have to make to the world, we all have to look at our own skills and our own talents that we all have represented by good deeds. Am I artistic? Will I use art to bring out, express a Jewish idea? Will I use comedy to make other people laugh? What kind of attitudes do I have that other people don't? What kind of setbacks and traumas have I experienced and circumstances have I gone through that I can use to help other people? Where does my unique place in business, where does that take me that gives me different opportunities that others may not? Or what kind of unique opportunities does my wealth give me that I can help other people out or come to different scenarios and circumstances? And that is something that we all have as a unique idea. And we all have to look at our own uniqueness and bring that to the table within the framework of our community, within the framework of collective Judaism. And these aren't a contradiction. We don't need to go too far out of, we don't need to go out of the framework of Judaism in order to find that uniqueness, as many try to think. Just like Bach and Mozart, who were revolutionary, they did not need to create new keys on a piano in order to revolutionize music. They were able to use the same keys, but they brought their own unique talents to the table. Like the Rebbe writes to a famous Italian Cubist sculpture, and he writes him as follows: You write that there must be an outlet for special talents, including that of the art of sculptures, among Jews, and you mentioned the eruption of such outlets in recent generations. It is true, of course, that such talents seek expression, but the Shulchan Aruch provides ample room for such expression without infringement of the Torah. It is the duty of the Jew to recognize that his creativity and special talents are bestowed upon him by God. Whether or not he harmonizes those talents with Torah depends upon the artist himself. The same applies to every field of human endeavor, not only art, but also science. And the idea is we all have our unique contribution, and we can find that within Torah itself. How we can express that, how we can bring that talent that we have to the table and injecting that into our religious life without having to give up on our religious life, our community life, because they are not a contradiction, they are not mutually exclusive. So an exercise that we can take is think about what unique talents do you have and how can you utilize that within Judaism? There's a friend that I have, met him years ago. His name is Tamar Goodman. Back then, he was still in high school. Back then, he was still in high school, Tamir Goodman, and he was an extremely good basketball player. And certain yeshivas that he went to didn't like his unique expression with basketball. Ultimately, he ended up in the right yeshivas, but ultimately back to playing in varsity at basketball in Maryland until he had to find a Christian school to play in. This is a long story, but I'm going to make it short. He had to play for a Christian school that didn't play on Shabbos, that he can get away with that, or at least that they would recognize Shabbos and would let him not play on Shabbos. And he was very good to the point that he got very unique scholarships to different universities, and he continued to play basketball, making a Kiddush Hashem, wearing his yarmulke and tzitzis, because he didn't need to squash or squander his talents of basketball because of religion. They weren't mutually exclusive. So he ended up taking his talents to Eretz Yisrael and playing in Eretz Yisrael in the great league over there. And that's the idea of looking at what talents and circumstances talents that we have and circumstances that we've been through, what makes us unique and different than others. and how we can imbue that within our Judaism. So think about it. Think about different personality traits that you may have, different temperaments that you may have that make you unique and different than others. And instead of squashing them and trying to fit in with everybody else, recognize our own uniqueness and bring that to the table. Thank you for joining us tonight.